A drunk tourist snatched a sword from a guardsman, confident he could get away with anything. But when the guardsman stepped forward, his commanding voice brought the crowd to a standstill. What happened next became a lesson for everyone. Let's start from the beginning. London. A typical morning near Buckingham Palace. A crowd of tourists eagerly gawked at the guards in their iconic red uniforms and famous bearskin hats. Among the throng stood James, tall, well-built, and exuding a serious demeanor. At 30, he epitomized discipline and pride in British heritage. He stood motionless, like a monument, paying no attention to the countless cameras and shouts around him. But, as is often the case, someone decided to test his patience. A drunk tourist, a lanky man of about 40, dressed in an orange jacket and a baseball cap adorned with an American flag, seemed convinced he was the star of the show. His loud laughter echoed through the crowd. "Hey man, are you even alive?" he shouted, stepping closer to James. The crowd chuckled and some began recording. This, however, was just the warm-up. The tourist, apparently deciding the scene was dull without his antics, escalated. "Hey, is that sword even real, or is it just some toy for the show?" he jeered, inching closer. The onlookers froze. Some were appalled by his behavior, while others kept filming, anticipating a show. James stood as always, silent and dignified. The jokes turned into action faster than anyone expected. The tourist, now emboldened by his star power, took a sudden step forward. "Now that's what I call a souvenir," he hollered, grabbing the sword from the guard's scabbard. Time seemed to slow, and the crowd gasped. No one could react in time. "London, meet your new knight," the tourist bellowed, waving the sword above his head like a trophy. The reactions were mixed. Some laughed, thinking it was all part of a staged performance. But most stood in stunned disbelief. A young woman couldn't hold back. "This is disgusting! Put the sword back now!" Her demand, of course, went unanswered. The tourist, now the self-declared king of the moment, began to prance around like this was his personal stage. His movements were absurd, his behavior utterly inappropriate. James remained motionless, as protocol required. But something in his eyes suggested he was ready to act, should the situation demand it. "Hey, pal, how about a duel?" the troublemaker taunted, stepping closer to the guard, the sword still in hand. The crowd was no longer laughing. The atmosphere had shifted, growing tense. Cameras were rolling, and someone had already called security. Yet events were unfolding too quickly for help to arrive in time. The crowd was on edge. Some were still laughing, but most had begun murmuring about the inappropriateness of what was unfolding. At that moment, an elderly woman emerged from the crowd, holding her grandson's hand. She looked to be about 70, but her gaze carried a strength that many around her lacked. "Stop this at once!" she called out to the tourist. "This man serves his country, and you're disgracing it." The tourist, oblivious to any wrongdoing, laughed louder, waving the sword dramatically. "Relax, Granny. It's just a show. Even the Queen would get a kick out of this." But before he could finish his sentence, James, who had remained motionless throughout the bizarre spectacle, took a deliberate step forward. His movements were sharp, as if rehearsed to perfection. Raising his hand, he spoke, his voice calm yet so firm that the tourist visibly paled. "You've crossed the line. Hand over the sword. Now." James's voice carried such authority that the tourist froze. The crowd fell silent, realizing the situation had taken a serious turn. At that moment, palace security arrived at the scene. The tourist, sensing that his antics had spiraled out of control, began stammering excuses. All right, I was just joking. It's all fun, right?" But it was too late. One of the guards swiftly and wordlessly seized the sword from his hands, and the crowd erupted into applause. Some jeered at the tourist, who had gone from self-proclaimed star to a flustered fool. "Serves you right," someone shouted from the crowd. The tourist, now red-faced and humiliated, darted his eyes around, desperate for an escape. The tourist was escorted off palace grounds, leaving behind a barrage of boos and condemning shouts. His bravado had evaporated like beer foam in an empty glass. Surrounded by security, he looked absurd, drunk, disoriented, and most of all, utterly disgraced. The crowd lingered, buzzing with chatter about what had just happened. Many had already posted videos of the incident on social media. The reactions were swift. Comments like, "Who do these people think they are, disrespecting the guard?" and "Served him right, the guard showed real class," began flooding in. At the gate where it all happened, peace was finally restored. The elderly woman, who had become the voice of reason during the chaos, turned to her grandson and said softly, "Remember this, my boy. True honor is standing firm for what you represent, no matter what." As if in affirmation of her words, James adjusted his uniform and returned to his post. His face was as stoic as ever, but someone in the crowd noticed the faintest twitch of his lips. Perhaps a subtle nod to victory, known only to him. The crowd gradually dispersed, but it was one of those moments that stayed with people. Everyone present, whether they had laughed or condemned, walked away with a lingering thought. The Queen's Guard isn't just a prop for selfies. James remained a symbol of resilience, unshaken by arrogance or mockery. And so, London returned to its usual morning rhythm. Yet, amidst the chatter of tourists, a new kind of whisper could be heard. "Did you see how that guard handled it? A true hero."